On the 15th of February 1941, a German fighting unit arrived in Tripoli, Libya. Their commander was about to become famous. Soon, millions were familiar with these early pictures from the North African theatre of war.
General Rommel, der Führer des deutschen Afrikakorps, bei seinen Truppen an der Front.
Goebbels wanted to make him into a folk hero, but he wasn't easy to get close to.
I first encountered Rommel coming out of no man's land. He suddenly appeared. He was, how should I put it, not very friendly. And so whenever I saw Rommel, when I got back to my driver, I said to him, "Drive that way, so we don't meet him."
Images for the newsreel were supposed to show that he was one of them.
Der General hält Mittagsrast inmitten seiner Soldaten.
But the official propaganda was misleading.
Rommel was not popular. You will be shocked, but it's the truth. I can only say the opposite. When Rommel arrived somewhere, every soldier and even some officers hid. It was a punishment to have to report to Rommel.
Rommel always pushed himself to the limit. Soldiers used to say that in battle he was always on the front line. That could mean losing a sense of perspective.
At the most critical times, everyone was of course living on adrenaline, and Rommel sometimes just lost it. He would then suddenly turn up directing traffic in Benghazi or commanding retreating troops, which of course many other officers could have done instead of him.
So was he a military genius or just a run-of-the-mill officer?
Based on my own limited experience, I'm convinced that in this last war, there was a large number of German generals who could have done a similar job to Rommel, or perhaps even better.
In spite of this, he became the most popular German general of the Second World War, and a legend. Rommel was born on November the 15th, 1891, at Heidenheim an der Brenz. He was the third of 5 children. His parents were Helena and Erwin, who was a headmaster. He was christened Johannes Erwin Eugen. As a boy, he was deeply impressed by the Zeppelin works at Lake Constance and wanted to become an aircraft engineer. But his father sent him to join the army. By the age of 20, he was a lieutenant. Rommel trained infantry cadets in Weingarten, a small town in southern Germany. The young officer had a girlfriend, Walburga Stemmer. In 1913, she got pregnant.
He wrote Walburga, my grandmother, a letter when she was pregnant and said to her that he was saving to pay off all his debts. And then they could get a little home together. And it all had to be perfect, he wrote. He called her my little mama.
In December 1913, an illegitimate daughter was born, Gertrude. The officer had to choose between his military career and marriage.
2 months after his letter, when he said they would get the flat and they would stay together, 2 or 3 months later, she got another letter explaining that he couldn't marry her.
In August 1914, the First World War had begun. Rommel wrote to his sister,
"If I die, I have only one wish, and that is to know that poor Trudel and Walburga are looked after. I love them more than I love myself, and I want to make up for what I have done wrong before."
Rommel became a fighter. He was always in the thick of things and was wounded many times. He was promoted and decorated. In October 1917, he was at the Isonzo front in Italy. The highest German medal, Pour le Mérite, had been reserved for the capture of Mount Matadure. Rommel wanted it. At the head of his men, he stormed to the top of the Matadure, but somebody else got the medal. Rommel felt robbed of his prize. He handed in a complaint. He had to wait for weeks before hearing that it had been upheld. The fear of being overlooked would pursue him all his life. Before the war ended, Rommel had married another woman, a former girlfriend, Lucy Mollin. After the defeat and the Treaty of Versailles, the German army was limited to 100,000 men. It was a bad time to be a soldier. Rommel gave up thoughts of a glorious career and opted for service at a provincial garrison instead of general staff training. He wanted to be with the troops. In 1929, he became a lecturer at the Infantry Training School in Dresden. One of Rommel's pupils remembers his classes.
I'll just give one example. It was in the French campaign. There was a house on an occupied hill, and it had a barn, and there were a load of Frenchmen there, shooting like mad, just as Rommel wanted to attack. But the artillery said they'd got to take this hill. They needed it as an observation post. So Rommel was given the order to take the hill. But he said to himself, "If I attack, the losses will be colossal." Then he said to us, "So what would you have done?" So we started to talk about how he would have built covering fires, etc., etc. And afterwards we asked him, "And what did you do?" He said, "I crept up with my pistol and shot at the barn with flares. It burned, the French disappeared, and we were in."
Rommel now had a son and retreated into his private life. Soldiers like him were no longer needed. Hitler seized power on the 30th of January 1933.
Sie hören jetzt immer Jubel zu den Fenstern herauf. Im Leben immer weiter die Fackeln, der ganze Platz, der ganze Kaiserplatz ist in Tageshelle getaucht. Ein wunderbares Bild. Diese gereckten Arme, das Heilrufen.
It was the end of democracy.
Army officers had been consciously kept apolitical. We kept out of politics. We were not allowed to express ourselves politically in any way or to be involved in politics at all. And so when the change of government, if you can call it that, took place on the 30th of January 1933, we felt more like observers than people affected by it.
Hitler courted these observers. In Potsdam, the cradle of military Prussia, Hitler, a corporal in the war, paid his respects to Hindenburg, the former head of Army Command. Rommel enjoyed that. For 14 long years, he hadn't had any promotion.
You have to imagine, these army officers have been fiddling around with cardboard tanks and wooden rifles for more than a decade. Now, suddenly, here was someone who said, "That's enough. Put the toys away. You're going to get proper rifles, proper pistols, and proper tanks now." I can understand that a man who was an officer of conviction would be carried along and enthused by this.
On the 14th of September 1934, Hitler attended the Harvest Festival in Goslar. The newly appointed head of the garrison, Erwin Rommel, presented his troops. It was the first time he'd met Hitler in person. Hitler didn't notice Rommel. But what did Rommel think of Hitler?
My father and my mother were deeply impressed by the successes at home and abroad. Of course, they were fake. Hitler just printed money and pretended to be a miracle worker. But at the time, people didn't see through it. Also, Hitler gave the impression of being on the side of the military, and they liked that too. So, I can't say that in the years 1933, 34 and 35, my father understood Hitler's true nature. Not at all. If that had been the case, then his behavior would not have been at all explicable.
Rommel was promoted. He became lecturer in tactical warfare at the military academy in Potsdam. He published a textbook of his experiences in the First World War. The attack on Mount Matadure became a bestseller. In 1938, after the Anschluss with Austria, Rommel was promoted again. He became head of the military academy in Wiener Neustadt. The terrible aspects of the regime had become apparent here, too.
Sadly, like many others, my father considered the whole Jewish issue to be something negative. Certainly something negative, but also something that was eclipsed by all the other achievements.
Hitler marched into Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Rommel was appointed commander of Hitler's headquarters. It was more a question of appearances than for military reasons. For a short while, Rommel belonged to Hitler's most intimate circle. Did he know that Hitler planned war?
My mother always said that when my father left for the Führer's headquarters in 1939, he was still saying, "As long as my generation who experienced the World War are still around, you can be sure that there won't be a second."
Rommel was wrong. On the 1st of September 1939, Poland was attacked. Rommel had been promoted to Major General. He was responsible for Hitler's security. Now he got to know the dictator better. He wrote to his wife,
"I'm often with the Führer, even at the most confidential meetings. This trust brings me the greatest happiness, more so than my rank of general. In the evenings, there's always a long progress meeting that I take part in and am sometimes asked for my opinion. It is wonderful to witness the clarity in his treatment of problems. Last night I was allowed to sit next to him. Soldiers are at last valued again."
Rommel revered the dictator. Hitler liked Rommel too. He didn't display the usual arrogance of the general staff. Rommel was different from most officers. He was self-taught and a man of action, just like Hitler. Rommel was given a tank division, which was unusual for an infantryman. This was a mark of Hitler's favor. When France was invaded, Rommel was able to prove himself. Just as he'd done in World War I, he stormed through the country at the head of his troops.
I was in the same army, in the 4th, and we heard about Rommel. Some sergeant major said to me, "There's this mad divisional commander. He just rushes forward without any cover on the left or right, and yet he's successful." And that was the Gespenster division. We only learned later on that it was Rommel.
On the 18th of June 1940, when France capitulated, Mussolini came to Munich. Only 1 week before, he had declared war on France and England. Now Il Duce belonged to the victors, and he wanted more. Libya was then an Italian colony. In September, Mussolini's soldiers in Libya attacked British forces in Egypt. The Desert War began. The offensive lasted only 90 kilometers. There were no reinforcements. The Italian forces were exhausted.
And then when Mussolini declared war on us, we saw this as a traitorous act, that when Britain was down, and obviously losing the war, that Italy would come in like we described him as a pie-eyed dog, a scavenger, to win what he could when we were on our knees. And we decided there and then that he wouldn't, that he'd pay. So this was the attitude we went in, that this was an act of traitorism by Mussolini and the Italian people. And so we had a debt to pay, and we'd make them pay, and we did.
In December, the British forces in Egypt started to fight back. Within 8 weeks, the Italian army in Libya was destroyed. The colony appeared to be lost. Mussolini asked his ally for help. An unconventional man was needed for the Desert War, Rommel. Hitler described him as the most daring tank general in the German army. Rommel was sent from occupied France to North Africa. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. The first German tanks rolled into Tripoli, capital of Libya, on the 12th of March 1941. Rommel, now the commander of the German forces in Africa, came down to the docks himself. His task was to halt the British advance, but Rommel had bigger plans. Heinz Werner Schmidt, a young lieutenant, was also at the docks. He was an observer in the Italian colony of Eritrea in East Africa.
Rommel looked at me and then spoke to me. He wanted to know what conditions were like down there. I told him the truth as I saw it. After all, I had been there only 24 hours before. I told him that as far as I could judge, we could not achieve anything militarily. He said, "Lieutenant, what do you know? We will push them back to the Suez Canal and then turn right. You are dismissed."
Rommel resorted to cunning to simulate strength. He told the tank drivers to drive round the block and then line up again in the parade.
And then I noticed that something was wrong with the chain link on one tank. I thought, good God, they could have got it repaired. And then a bit later I saw the same problem again. Then I realized what was going on. I thought, God, haven't I already seen that tank?
Rommel sent his soldiers straight from the parade into the desert to fight the British.
In the desert you saw mile after mile of dust, blown about in the air. And even when you couldn't make out any troops, you always saw masses of dust. Rommel invented the following. At the back of a Volkswagen, he put a little motor with a propeller that created clouds of dust. He sent off 3 adapted Volkswagens into the desert, and enemy reconnaissance thought it was a whole regiment.
What Rommel didn't know was that this trick was in vain. The British troops were being transferred to Greece. Finally, after 900 kilometers, the first clash with the enemy took place at the desert fort El Agheila. Lieutenant Winrich Baer led the shock troops.
I went off on foot with a small detachment along the beach. It was night. We took this fort, but it soon became clear that apart from hundreds of thousands of fleas, there was not one single British soldier there. They only turned up in the morning mist with a few reconnaissance vehicles. So we got them, knocked them out, and that was it.
Lieutenant Baer had his camera with him. These are his pictures of the Battle of El Agheila.
And that was the first big encounter with the English. And because it had a certain strategic importance, the silly little story appeared in the German press. And Fort El Agheila, according to press reports, was like a Verdun or something. And we were supposed to have fought a great battle. In reality, it was a silly little children's cowboy and Indians affair.
Feuer auf angreifende englische Panzer vor Agaila. Generalleutnant Rommel, der kommandierende General des deutschen Afrikakorps, leitet in vorderster Linie den Angriff. Deutsche Panzer stoßen vor. Angriff auf Agaila.
Rommel appeared at the center of the production, although he didn't actually fly in until the following morning.
Agaila ist zurückerobert. Die deutsche Flagge weht über dem Wüstenfuchs.
Rommel himself was not against being used increasingly for propaganda. If a cameraman came and took pictures, he didn't mind. He didn't mind being photographed.
Rommel became the star of the newsreels.
Die Stellungen werden sofort gegen englische Gegenangriffe gesichert.
Rommel would sometimes pose. If he noticed a cameraman who wanted him in profile, he would thrust forward his forceful chin and hold the pose for a few seconds to give the photographer time.
Now he could no longer be overlooked. The myth was being created.
We actually noticed it properly on holiday. People only wanted to know about Rommel. Do you know Rommel? Did you see Rommel? It was mad. Everything was Rommeled.
Weiter geht der Vormarsch nach Osten. Nächstes Ziel, Benghazi.
The following year, Rommel's victorious journey was immortalized on celluloid.
Trotzdem wir dem engländern Zahl weit unterlegen waren, griffen wir bei Michili am 6. April 1941 an. Ja, wir stießen sogar mit Teilen unserer Streitmacht gleichzeitig nach Derna, um dort schon die Küstenstraße im Besitz zu bekommen und dem Feind den weiteren Rückzug aus der Cyrenaica zu verlegen.
In just 2 weeks, Rommel recaptured Cyrenaica and advanced right up to the Egyptian border. There was only one place he couldn't take: Tobruk.
Now, what surprised me on the 10th of April when the Germans made the first attack, they hadn't really done any reconnaissance. The only reconnaissance they could have done was with binoculars, and you can't do good reconnaissance with binoculars because you can't pick out the ground or what's on the ground. You can only see objects on the ground, you see. You can't see minefields and places.
Rommel didn't know that the Italians had made Tobruk into a heavily protected stronghold. 126 perfectly camouflaged bunkers, wire entanglements, minefields and tank traps surrounded the harbour town. Now the British elite troops were lying in wait for Rommel. Without realizing this, the first German soldiers pushed forwards against the stronghold.
And on the 10th of April, they put in an attack. And to our surprise, they attacked along the road. Now, the road had been ranged by our artillery and anti-tank guns. And they advanced with infantry and armoured cars. And they ran into terrible fire. There was, first of all, an artillery engagement between the artillery of both sides. But once they advanced, they hadn't a chance. They lost a lot of men.
Rommel wanted Tobruk at any price.
General Rommel landet mit seinem Storch an der Front vor Tobruk. General Rommel gibt Befehl zu neuem Angriff.
For 4 days, his soldiers attacked the fortress. But it was hopeless. These pictures show the battle for Tobruk.
I felt at times that with his eagerness to go on, that he took unnecessary risks. And of course, people paid the price.
There were terrible losses. 1,240 men dead, wounded and captured at Tobruk. In Berlin, there were increasing complaints about the behavior of the self-willed general. He was said to lack perspective and to treat his men harshly, abruptly, and even slanderously.
I did see him disregard the presence of some ordinary soldiers of a troop. If he felt that a certain officer had not done his duty, then he was quite likely to give him a good dressing down and yell, "Go back to the barracks and get the basic training of a recruit." And if that is said to an officer in front of his assembled troops, it is quite hard.
In May 1941, the chief of the General Staff of the army, Franz Halder, tried to get rid of this mad soldier, as he called him. Hitler wouldn't hear of it. For Africa, he needed a man like Rommel, someone who could achieve a lot with limited means.
Es folgten harte Kämpfe am Rasmadauer, vor allem im Mai, die beinahe mit Kampfverhältnissen vor Verdun zu vergleichen sind. Aber der deutsche Soldat und neben ihm auch die italienischen Kameraden haben diese schwierigen Zeiten überstanden, haben jeden Versuch, die Festung Tobruk zu entsetzen, abgewehrt oder uns die Stellung an der ägyptischen Grenze zu entreißen.
His whole life was about being a soldier. Beyond a certain point, you couldn't have a personal talk with him. It's presumptuous of me to say you couldn't. But he wouldn't readily talk about such things. Rommel never asked me about my family, what I do, or whether I'm a career soldier or not.
Rommel was only interested in his war. His chief of staff later described him as an uncompromising, hard and impersonal man.
In spite of everything, his greatness was recognized especially by the soldiers, who often saw him right at the very front. That makes an impression. The Italians weren't used to that. And so, through his personal behavior, the men themselves said, and even the officers, it was worth putting your back into it for someone like that, who did the same himself.
Rommel's behavior was also used at home for propaganda.
Generaloberst Rommel auf seinem Gefechtsstand. Immer ist bei seinen vordersten Einheiten.
In Italy, if a general arrived, he was always surrounded by a huge entourage. It was as though a general was a superior being you could not get near to. But Rommel you saw in the thick of battle. So close he could get hit by the same bullet that gets you. I'd never seen anything like it.
Even the enemy was impressed by his courage.
When we spoke about the Italians, we spoke about the Italians. When we spoke about the Germans, it used to be the Jerrys. But very soon we adopted the phrase, when we spoke about the Germans, we just said Rommel.
At daybreak on the 18th of November 1941, British troops broke out of the Tobruk stronghold. This marked the start of the British counter-offensive. 3 weeks later, Rommel had no choice but to retreat.
Es ist mir dieser Entschluss bitter schwer gefallen, Tobruk freizugeben, das wir nun über ein halbes Jahr belagert hatten, und vor dem Feind zu weichen. Und man macht sich keinen Begriff von den Schwierigkeiten, die ich damals hatte, schon deshalb, weil ein großer Teil meiner Truppen gar nicht motorisiert war.
9 months later, the tank group Africa was back where its advance started, in Alageila. The German interlude in Africa seemed to be over.
The way in which he had completely routed the forces there in his first advance towards Tobruk had, of course, made everybody think he was a remarkable man. and his victory at this battle in May made everybody very feel that he was a brilliant commander. But I don't remember people talking about him as if he was some wunderkind.
On the 5th of January 1942, for the first time in a long while, a sea convoy arrived without any losses, bringing with it 54 new tanks. Rommel again pressed ahead successfully. On the 29th of January, Benghazi was taken by the Germans for the second time. From a military viewpoint, it was an insignificant victory, but it was urgently needed by Hitler, who spoke the next day at the Berlin Sportpalast.
Wir werden fechten, wo wir stehen. Keinen Fußbreit vorn ohne Kapp aufgeben. Und wenn wir einen Fußbreit aufgeben, sofort wieder vorstoßen. Und wir sind ja so glücklich, es gestern zu wissen, dass unser Generaloberst Rommel...
It was the first time that Hitler mentioned him publicly. Hitler's war of conquest in Russia had come to a standstill, so Rommel's victory was used to distract from the disasters on the Eastern Front.
In dem Moment, in dem sie glaubten, hingeschlagen zu haben, sofort wieder kehrt machte und ihnen wieder zurückschlug.
Es ist kein Zweifel, dass Rommel... There is no doubt that Rommel was exploited by Hitler and Goebbels as a hero figure, and also that, if I may be critical, he did not object to that.
Auf dem Flugplatz des Führerhauptquartiers. Generaloberst Rommel trifft auf Afrika ein.
Dearest Lou, isn't it wonderful that I am able to serve the Führer, the people, and the new idea? Your Erwin.
Der Führer überreicht Generaloberst Rommel als 6. Offizier der deutschen Wehrmacht das Eichenlaub mit Schwertern zum Ritterkreuz des Eisernen Kreuzes.
In the East, Hitler was waging a war of annihilation. Rommel didn't yet know about the mass killings of Jewish men, women and children behind the front. His theater of war was far away.
There's one thing I have to emphasize, and I say this with great respect and great responsibility. The little I saw of the Africa Corps, there was never any reference or any hint that they were anti-Jewish.
Rommel was a soldier. Hitler's racial mania was something he refused to accept. In May, he started to advance again, intending to take Tobruk. Bir Hakeim was in the south of the British position at Gazala. 3,600 soldiers were entrenched here. The French had joined the British under General de Gaulle. Among them were members of the Foreign Legion.
There were Poles, Yugoslavs, Serbs, Croats, and even Austrians. There weren't many Austrians. They joined the Foreign Legion after the Anschluss. They did not accept Hitler's annexing their country, and so they joined us.
The news of the German and Austrian Foreign Legionnaires got back to Hitler's headquarters. On the 9th of June, Rommel received an order.
The Führer has ordered that these should be treated extremely harshly. They are to be mercilessly killed.
Rommel was shocked that people should be shot for just doing their duty like we did. They were enemies, but not partisans or anything like that. You have to respect them. They're men, like us. That won't be done, he said. I can't be responsible for that.
On the 11th of June, Bir Hakeim fell to the Germans. 2,619 so-called Free French escaped. 500 were taken prisoner. According to the peace treaty with France, they counted as guerrillas. They were also threatened by the death penalty.
Rommel believed that you don't shoot men who are fighting a regular battle, wearing a regular uniform. But Rommel was also someone who feared reprisals. I mean, he was afraid that German prisoners would be treated the same way.
Rommel resisted the orders to kill, but he didn't yet question that he was serving a criminal regime.
The Desert War was really a war without hate. It was his good luck that his image was built up in Libya. He owes his reputation to Libya. His reputation as a great general, but also his reputation as a man who succeeded in waging a clean war.
In battle, this clean war was as murderous as any other. Time and again, Rommel got himself into danger. During the attack on the Gazala position, a missile hit his car. His first staff officer, Siegfried Westphal, was wounded.
Rommel was okay, I was okay, the driver was okay, but Westphal was hit in the back. Pouring with blood, he fell out of the car and landed on his front in the desert. He was covered in blood. Rommel said, "Schliepenbach, Leipzig, we must get away." I thought to myself, you can't just leave the colonel lying there. I said to Leipzig, "You take the field marshal back." I don't know how to say it. I was ambivalent. I could understand that Rommel couldn't stay. It was much too dangerous. On the other hand, I was a bit shocked that he had not told me to deal with Colonel Westphal. I was somewhat shocked that he expected me to drive away with him and leave Westphal there.
Schlippenbach saved Colonel Westphal. 3 days later, Rommel met the man he believed dead.
And Rommel was very surprised to see my father again and said, "Oh, I thought you were dead." My father was naturally very hurt and took it to heart.
In the early hours of the 20th of June 1942 at Tobruk, Rommel's forces finally broke through the outer wall of the fortress. Victory was now within reach.
Then they started firing on us relentlessly. Rommel said, "Idiots, why are they firing at us? Schlippenbach, drive up and tell them to surrender. Tell them Tobruk has already surrendered." Of course, it wasn't true. I thought it was a suicide mission, but drove on up. Then there was some cover. I crawled on further and called out, "Surrender, surrender, the war is finished. The war is finished. Surrender, surrender." And that was the only English I knew. Of course, they had no intention of giving up and carried on shooting. So we crawled back only to find Rommel's whole staff had disappeared. I was rather pissed off. I got depressed about it, thinking, well, Schlippenbach, he doesn't care at all what happens to you. He orders you to drive up there. They're supposed to surrender. And then he drives away.
Rommel drove his sappers on impatiently. By dawn, they had removed the last obstacle, the tank traps. The way into the stronghold was clear.
And then he said something very clever to me, which even then made a lot of sense. Do you know, if you are the leader of an army and have responsibility for thousands of lives, you can't get involved in an individual's fate. If you do, you take your eye off the ball, and you can't manage the responsibility if you worry about one man's fate. I found that very illuminating.